again to the Bean Museum. My name is Josh. I am the education assistant here at the Bean. Today we've got something really special for you guys. We are going to take you on a tour of our bird collection. So the Bean Museum has two main parts, or two main focuses or objectives. On one hand, we have stuff that's available to the public for display. Our role is education, where we're teaching everybody we can about the life sciences, right? But there's a part of our museum that most people never see, and those are our research collections. So at the museum we have 8 different research collections that house somewhere around 3 million specimens. These research collections are closed to the public, so you can't just access them unless you have their work here or you know somebody who works here. But since we're closed, we thought we'd give you guys a little peek into what these collections are. So this week we're going to see our bird collection, and this is it. So it looks kind of boring on the surface, but we'll show you how exciting it is here in a second. But I first want to talk about a couple of things. So I want to talk a little bit about why these collections are important and what we do in these collections, just generally, not just here in our bird collection, but in all of our collections. So scientists are responsible for what is called taxonomy. So taxonomy is a fancy word for classifying living things, or classifying things generally. And so classification, or taxonomy, is classification. In here, we have everything organized by order, family, genus, and species. So all living things in the world can be classified using the same system. So typically we start off with a kingdom, and there are scientists that are kind of debate on how we should classify everything, but generally we accept that there are kingdoms, like animals and plants, and protists and bacteria, right? There are a few different kingdoms. The number of kingdoms right now is up for debate, but there are kingdoms, phylums, classes. And so when we get down to class, all birds are in the same class. They're all in the class Aves, A-V-E-S, which is the Latin word for bird. Now, all birds are in the same class, and within that class of birds, we have them split up even further. So we have them split up into orders. So, for example, ducks and geese are all one order. Owls are their own order, right? And we have all the birds then split up into these large orders. And then within those orders, we have them split up into families, and then genera, or what we'd say, or the singular genus, and then species. So anytime you see the scientific name or the Latin name of an animal or a plant, there's usually 2 words. The first one is the genus. The second one is the species. And we'll show you some examples of that in a little while. And these research collections are really important for taxonomy work. So we have specimens in here, and we classify them, we give them names, and that helps us, or these specimens in here can help us determine what families or genera or species they all are. And these are what we base those names off of. So for example, if someone were to go find a new species, let's say you somehow found a new species of bird. In order to officially classify it as a new species, there are a couple things you have to do. One is you have to prove that it's different than things that are similar. And then there are a few different measurements that you'll take. You'll describe it using color, size, weight, You'll describe it with where it's found, things like that. And these collections are a repository of that information. So, for example, I can take, let's see, we could take a bird like this. This is what we call a research mount. I'll explain that in a minute. But we can take measurements. We can measure the bill or the beak. We can measure the legs, the feet, specific bones. We can measure the length of the wings. We can look up really close and get detailed descriptions of the coloring, right? So all that information is really important. And unfortunately, that is all information that's also really hard to get while the birds are moving around and are alive. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we collect these specimens as well. At any time, if you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask me during this, feel free to comment those, and I will try to answer as many of them as I can. Hopefully I'll get to all of them. So, let's see. Let's start with, why don't we start going down this aisle here.
We do actually have a question.
Oh, good. What's the question?
From Cam. She asks, or he asks, what is the stuff that's on the table?
Good. So on the table we have birds, and these birds are for they're part of our teaching collection. So we have a class here at BYU called Ornithology. Ornithology is the study of birds. I'll say that again. Ornithology, the study of birds. We have an ornithology class here at BYU, and once a week they meet at the Bee Museum to look at some of our specimens. So all of these ones here on the tables are set aside specifically for that class, for teaching that class. So the students can get up close and look and touch and all that, and all those things while they're learning about the birds. So again, these are all set aside specifically for teaching. But we have a lot of stuff here in these cabinets that are set aside just for research. So let's open up one of these cabinets and take a look. So, first off, before I open up the cabinet, I'm going to have our camera people come up and show you. But on the outside of the cabinet, we have a label. On the label, we see Accipitridae. That is the family. Right? That is the family. And then Buteo is the genus. And then here below Buteo, we have Buteo and Regalis, which are both species names. So in this cabinet, we have birds from the family Accipitridae, the genus Buteo, and we have both the species Buteo and Regalis, which are, we'll see them in a minute, but they are the common buzzard and the ferruginous hawk. So the Buteo is the scientific name for the common buzzard. Those are found in Europe and Asia. And then Buteo regalis is the ferruginous hawk, which are found in Western North America. So we have them in Utah. So I will open this cabinet up. And first thing you'll see is we have several different drawers. Let's make sure this stays open. Okay. We have different drawers, and each drawer has its own label too, right? Telling you what is on the drawer. And then you can see on the drawer itself, we have our specimens. That door does not want to stay open. Okay, now you'll notice a couple of things about these specimens. One, they aren't really made to look pretty. So you can see above me, and as you might have seen earlier, we have lots of birds up here that are taxidermied. So they're made to look like they're alive, right? So they look really nice. They've got fake eyes put in them, right? And they look like they're flying. These are made for display. But for our research specimens, we don't need to make them look pretty because on display for the public. Since they're just scientists that are looking at them, we have them in what's called a research mount. So we lay them flat, and with the birds, they'll have their feet crossed, and usually they have a tag that is attached to their ankles, and they're stuffed with usually cotton or straw. So you can see we don't put fake eyes in them, so they have cotton sticking out of the eyes. And sometimes also, if they're really large or flimsy, we'll also put, you can see there's a wooden stick that is in there to help keep it nice and stiff to make it easier for handling. Sometimes we also use wires or things like that. So on this drawer, you'll notice that we have Buteo regalis. So this is a ferruginous, these are all ferruginous hawks. Now, we also have labels on all of these specimens, and that is really, really important. So these labels, you can see this one is maybe a little tough to read because this is just handwritten. Sometimes we'll also type them up. But these labels tell us really important information. So the labels will tell us what it is, so they'll usually write the scientific name on here. They'll tell us the gender of the bird. They will also tell us where the bird was collected and when it was collected and who collected it. So all those things are really important. Now, part of the reason for having so many, you can see we've got a bunch of ferruginous hawks, right? They're all the same species. So why do we have more than one? I'll let you guys think about that for a second. Why would we have more than one of the same species? Why would that be important for science?
While we were thinking about that, Cam does have another question.
Great.
He asks, did you kill them?
The answer is a combination of yes and no. Some of them we did. We collected them specifically for our scientific collections because, again, they'll tell us really important information. But when we go and collect a specimen, we're typically only, especially with some things like birds or things like raptors, right? We're only really collecting one or maybe two at a time. So we're only removing a very, 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 very small fraction of the total number of these animals out in the wild, right? We don't remove them if we know that they're endangered, right? Or if we can find out whatever information we need without removing them from the wild, we will do that. But there are some things, in order to study them, we need to have them dead. So, for example, anytime you go and look, so if you read in a book or you search the internet for information about an animal or a plant or some other living thing, right, they'll give you lots of really cool information, right? They'll tell you things like how big it is, or generally, right? They'll give you a size range. They'll tell you where it's found. They'll tell you all these different things about it. Maybe how many eggs are found in a nest at one time, what the chicks look like. And a lot of that information, some of that information at least, can be found without having to collect birds. But some things, such as how their digestive systems work, right? How they respond to diseases or things like that. The only way to really look at that is by looking at the insides of the birds. And unfortunately, there are some animals that don't handle surgery very well. Plus, we don't want to cut open a bird to then try to sew it back up and then release it back into the wild. That is not very ethical. So when we do collect birds or other animals, we follow strict guidelines on how we put them down, right? So we're not just bashing them over the head. We're not doing anything like that, right? We're not shooting them. Typically, we use something like gas. So we do it as humanely as possible. So some of them we did go out and collect, but some of them, though, we didn't kill. Some of them were found dead already. So either they were roadkill somebody just found it dead in their backyard or while they were out hiking and they brought it to us. Or they found a sick bird that went to a wildlife rescue and then died and then was given to us. Or sometimes they even come from places like zoos. So after they die in a zoo, they donate it to us. So we get these birds in a lot of different ways, not just by going out and killing them. And that's not the goal of the research collection, right? So we collect a few of them to give us a better understanding of how that species works, which then gives us really valuable information that helps us help them, right? The information that we gain from collecting a few individuals helps us better conserve the whole population. Good. Are there any other questions? All right. So, let's see. I want to point out a couple of different things here with the ferruginous hawks. So you can see this hawk right here is what we'd call a pretty typical coloration. So ferruginous hawks have these red legs, but a pretty white chest, white neck here, and then kind of a brownish, reddish back. This one actually has a lot of white on its head. But ferruginous hawks also come in a few different colors. There's what we call a dark morph, or it is a solid dark brown, sometimes even almost black. Right? And then this one, you can see, does not have the red legs. So that's important information, right? So us being able to have these birds here, then we can find out, we can know for sure that they're all the same species by looking at other specific measurements, so that when we see one out in the wild that looks like this and one that looks like this, we can better identify them both as the same species, right? That's really important information. All right, let's look at a different cabinet. This is a good example right here. So, again, I'll have you guys come up and look at the label here on the cabinet. So, the family is Accipitridae, so the same family as the ferruginous hawks that we saw, right? But we have a different genus. This is the genus Accipiter and the species Gentilis, which are known as northern goshawks, or just goshawks. So you can see again, all these drawers are labeled. Now here we've got, these are all the same species again, but what do you guys notice? What do you notice about them? Are there any differences? Do you guys see any differences between all of these birds? And again, they're all the same species. But just take a look, just take a second and look. What differences do you notice? Do we have any other questions that have come up while we've been waiting? Okay, great. So one thing you probably noticed, because I'm sure you guys are really smart and observant, is that we have a couple of different color patterns here. And we have these three birds here that are really solid gray color. And then we have these three birds in the back that are more brown and have these kind of stripes down the front. So this is the adult coloration. So this is what the adults look like. These three back here are all juveniles. So their first year, so after they hatch, when the birds first hatch, they have downy feathers, so these little white balls of fluff. And then as they grow up, they grow in all of these feathers. And so this is what a first year goshawk typically looks like. So they're brown colored with these kind of brown stripes on a cream body. But birds do what we call molting. So every year they will drop their feathers and grow new ones, right? Because these feathers are really important to the birds for flying, right? For keeping warm and for flying. But as they're flying around with goshawks, as they're chasing their prey down, or with some birds as they're trying to escape prey. Sometimes those feathers get rough or they get broken or bent, which then makes them not as effective, right? They're not as useful. So because of that, every year birds will replace all their feathers. So they'll drop all the feathers and regrow them so that they have fresh feathers to start off. And they do that every summer. So with goshawks, that the next summer after they hatch, so for example, if one of these goshawks hatched last year in 2019, spring or summer of 2019, that means right now it would look like this, but then this summer it would drop all of those feathers and grow adult colors like these ones. So this is what they would look like by the end of this summer. A bird that was hatched last year would look like this by the end of this summer, 2020. Right, so this is the adult pattern, and this is the juvenile pattern. Good. Is there anything else you guys might notice? So you may also notice there are some size differences. And the size differences could be one of two things. Either it could just be that one bird happens to be smaller than another. Just like with people, we come in a lot of different sizes, right? Not everybody is the same height or the same weight or things like that, right? People come in all types of sizes. Birds are the same way. So there'll be, some of them are just naturally bigger or smaller. But with birds of prey, the females are also bigger than the males, and considerably bigger. So here, this one is a female. This one, though, is a male. So you can see, side by side, there's a noticeable size difference there, with the female being much bigger. Here, let me get close up to this camera, too. Right, the female is bigger than the male. Males are oftentimes somewhere around a third smaller than the females, and that goes for just about all birds of prey. Now another thing too, you guys on the other side of the camera won't notice this, but we sure notice it in here. Every time I open up one of these cabinets, there's a really strong smell. And we use, this one looks like has all worn out, but we use mothballs essentially. The same kind of chemical compound found in mothballs, we put in all of our cabinets. And mothballs are made to repel insects. So there are some insects, like there are certain beetles and moths especially, that will come and eat the skin. Right, and so mothballs, people have used them for a long time in their closets, especially if they have things like fur coats, because the moths will go in and eat at all the skin underneath. So we use the mothballs to protect all these specimens, because again, these are all really important for science, and they tell us a lot of really good information. And so we want to preserve them and protect them. So we put that stuff in there to help keep out all the bugs that might try to destroy our specimens. Now, I mentioned earlier that on these labels they tell us where and when the specimens were collected. And those are two really important pieces of information. So anytime you go and you look and you search an animal, search for an animal or a plant online, or you read in a book about them, anytime you read about where those animals can be found, we get that information, we know that information because of research collections. Because we have evidence, so this one was found or was collected in Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, Utah, right? So we know we've got evidence that goshawks can be found in that part of the world, right? Goshawks can be found in Salt Lake. That's really important information. And rather than, so part of the issue is just trying to look at them in the wild can be kind of tricky. Some people get really good at identifying birds or other animals or plants. But again, that taxonomy, that classification can sometimes be really tricky. And so for people who don't know very well how to identify those animals, someone could say, oh, I saw a goshawk over here, right? But they have no proof that it was for sure goshawk. Maybe they were mistaken and they thought it was a goshawk, but it was something else. So by having these collections, we have physical proof and evidence that that particular species can be found or has been found in an area. So anytime you see a map that shows you the distribution of an animal or plant, we know that information because of research collections. And the date is also really important too. So we also have evidence that that animal or plant or whatever was found at that location at a certain time in history. So these research collections can also help us to identify maybe places where populations have changed. So, for example, we have that goshawk from Salt Lake. Well, if we no longer find any goshawks in Salt Lake, we know that somehow their habitat has changed in Salt Lake, right? There are still currently goshawks in Salt Lake, but they're all just up against the mountains, just so you know. But for an example, we can find out if a certain species, how those populations are changing in different areas. So whether maybe it's no longer found in an area where it used to be, or we find it in a new location that we didn't know before, right? And we know all that, and we can keep record of that through our research collections. Okay. Let's move on a little bit. Are there any other questions? All right. Hopefully that just means that I'm just answering them all really well before you can ask them. Let's come down this aisle. So we just looked at a couple of hawks. Oh, we have a question.
So speaking of goshawks, how many of those birds live in Salt Lake City right now?
In the city of Salt Lake, probably none. Again, they're all going to be on. So goshawks are high elevation birds. So they like to live, especially in coniferous forests. So you'll find them back in the canyons behind Salt Lake City, right, in the mountains behind there. But actually in the city of Salt Lake, there are probably none. Maybe one or two juveniles come in as they're trying to figure out where they're going to live, right? But there's none probably inside of the city. There is actually a cousin of the goshawk, so another member of two different members of the same genus, so the genus Accipiter, both the Cooper's hawk and the sharp-shinned hawk, that are smaller and that are found more often inside of cities and towns. So inside the city of Salt Lake, you could find Cooper's hawks and maybe some sharp-shinned hawks. I know we have them here in the city of Provo, but we don't typically get goshawks. Like, for example, on BYU campus, I've seen Cooper's hawks, and we've had Cooper's hawks nest here, but not goshawks. Goshawks are going to be more up in the hills. So people that live up on the benches or up against the hills might occasionally see something like a goshawk come in, but they're not going to come all this far into town, if that makes sense. So you'll notice, so those couple of drawers we looked at were pretty big, that we could fit those large hawks, but there are birds that are even bigger than those, right? So we have special cabinets here that are extra big for storing those larger birds. This large cabinet on this label, I'll have you guys come up and see it in a second. There are lots of different families here because some of those members of the family can fit in the smaller drawers, so we have them all together, but those really big ones, we have to put in these larger ones, so they get a little bit out of order. But here, let me show you this first one. does not want to just rest by itself. So here's an example of those crystals that we use to repel the insects. Okay, but here in this drawer we've got a few different swans. The swans are obviously really big, so wouldn't fit in those smaller drawers, but we could fit them here. Yeah, we've got a couple of different species here, as well as a couple of cygnets. Cygnet is the name for a baby swan, or a swan chick. And again, we typically don't collect a chick as a specimen, but oftentimes out of a nest, you know, the swan or whatever other bird might lay a lot of different eggs, maybe 4, 5, 6, even more sometimes for some birds, and usually not all of those chicks are going to survive. So occasionally we will find some that have already passed away, and we'll keep them for our collection. But we're not purposefully going out and collecting chicks or cygnets. And just so you get some more ideas, here's a couple. So these are obviously not swans. We have a couple of, looks like, cranes. Let's see, this is a hobara, a ground nesting bird, a ground dwelling bird from Africa and the Middle East.
We have a question from
Great.
Lex. How often are you receiving new birds for the collection?
So right now we're not receiving a lot of new birds, and we're not really collecting a lot of new birds. So this our bird collection right now is fairly dormant, you might say. So we don't have professors or students really actively doing a lot of research in this collection, but we still do occasionally. So we've got an emeritus professor, Clayton White, who does still come in here and do some work occasionally. Our curator of the collection, Randy Larson, also does some stuff, but he has a lot of other projects going on, and so isn't necessarily actively collecting birds and bringing them in. But if we do find a unique bird or something that we don't have, or things like that, we would still probably accept the bird. So if somebody found one that had died and wanted to donate it, you could always reach out and ask, and there's a chance that we'll take it. Because having more specimens gives us more information, which is really good.
One other question
Great.
for you. How old are the birds in the collection?
Oh, that is a good question. So, I mentioned that on the labels, we put the dates that they were collected. So some of them have been collected recently, like in the last few years. Some of them were collected a very long time ago. So, for example, let's just look at this guy. Let's see. And sometimes I'll have multiple labels, so I can't find it always on here. This swan here was collected in 1966. So we have some that are at least that old. Older than maybe some of your parents. All right. I think I know another one that's a specific one in mind that's even older than that. Okay. So.
As well, which species do you have the most of?
Oof. That's tough to say. One thing we do have a lot of are peregrine falcons. So that's actually a really cool part of our collection. So Clayton White, the professor that I mentioned earlier, he's an emeritus professor, which means that he's retired. He did a lot of research on peregrine falcons and really helped out a lot when peregrines were endangered in North America in the 70s and 80s. He did a lot of research on them and was really helpful in bringing the peregrine falcon back to a healthy population like we have today. So you can see, I'll have you guys come walk down this aisle with me. Starting down here. So all of these, except for these two large cabinets are all falcons. So these cabinets all here on this side. Starting here, with part of this cabinet, we have Falco peregrinus, which are peregrine falcons. And then coming down here, we have, these are all peregrines, these are all peregrines, these are all peregrines. And then we've got a couple, these ones are not falcons, but then in this one, we have some that are hybrids. So there are some people that breed falcons for falconry and will mix two different species of falcons. So these ones are peregrines, and they're mixed with some other kind of falcon. So we've got a lot of peregrine falcons. And let me show you those real fast. Show you some of them anyway. This is a really cool, special part of our collection. And I'll show you a couple different drawers. So peregrines are a really special bird because peregrines can be found all over the world. There are peregrine species found in every continent except for Antarctica. And because there are so many different peregrines all over the world, there are also a lot of subspecies of peregrines. And we have all, or if most, if not all of those subspecies here in our collection. So this is a typical, this is an adult male peregrine falcon. So the adults are dark colored, like typically a gray, maybe a black. And then on the front, they'll be either a cream or this kind of peach color with these spots or stripes. But that's an adult male. You can see that there's a difference between an adult female and an adult male. Like I was talking about earlier, right? There's a size difference. So that's a female peregrine, that's a male peregrine. Both are adults. The juveniles have this more vertical stripe kind of pattern rather than the horizontal stripes like the adults. Let's look at, those are, so those ones in this drawer are the subspecies Nesioides, and I have to look up exactly where that one's from. But these ones down here are called Peale's peregrines. These ones are found on the Pacific Northwest coast, so in places like Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and up into Alaska.
So we do have two questions from Cam. The first
great.
one is, why don't we put these birds up in the museum?
That's a good question. So putting them upstairs, when we put them upstairs on display, we will often make them look really pretty, which takes a lot of work, right? Like these ones up here, they've been taxidermied, which takes a lot of work and it's a lot of resources. But then also upstairs, sometimes those mounts upstairs get damaged a little bit from light, so light can damage them, and they're more exposed to things like insects, right? So because of how important these are for science, we try to keep them preserved and tucked away nice and neat down here, so we can keep them as long as possible. So that's a great question.
So his second question is, how many animals do we have in the museum?
Oof. So in our research collections, for both plants and animals, we have somewhere around 3 million specimens. As for animals or plants that we have up on display, we have probably somewhere around 1,000, so maybe a little bit more. So yeah, that's a great question. So I want you guys to look at this real fast. These are both peregrines, but you can see that there's some different coloration. The Peale's peregrines down here are the largest subspecies of peregrine falcon in the world. So on average, they're going to be larger than other peregrines. But you'll notice that there's some color differences. So these ones are a lot darker than these. These are more gray, whereas this is more black. And then on the front, this has a more reddish color than this one, right? This one has kind of the solid peach color up here, and the striping starts, whereas this one has some spots up here above the striping. So there's a lot of variation even among the same species, which is again why these collections are so important, because we have records of all those variations within even the same species. Okay. Oh, and just for fun, while we're looking at these, let me tell you about since we got distracted from how old they are. This one here that we've been looking at was collected in 1989, whereas, let's see, this one here was collected, this was born in 1979, and this one died in 1984. So this one was specifically, had been taken out of the wild for falconry, which is maybe a subject for another day. And so we know exactly when it was born and when it died. And then after it died, whoever had the bird donated it to us as part of our collection.
Lex would like to ask you, what bird is your favorite, Josh?
It's the peregrine falcon. Yeah, the peregrine is my favorite. So the peregrine is the fastest animal in the world. They've been clock diving at over 240 miles an hour. Again, they're also found all over the world, which is also something really cool and unique about them. Also, I have one. So I am a falconer personally and have a peregrine falcon. So they're just really special to me. But again, that's a whole other topic for another video. But let's go back to this cabinet. So we were still looking at, we were talking about how old some of these birds were. This one right here, I'm going to be very gentle with it. So you can see it's a type of parrot. And this one was collected sometime, and we don't actually know the specific date because it looks like there's a question mark after it, but you can maybe see the date on there, 1901. So this bird was collected almost 120 years ago. So that's really cool. So that's a really cool piece of history that we have as part of our collection. Right? By having had them collected so long ago, we can now compare them with that same species today. So we can even see if there are small changes over time because of our collections. So we can see if there are changes in their size or colors or anything like that, partially because we have some of those specimens that are old, that we collected so long ago. Good. Those are great questions. So I think that, let's actually, this is becoming a very long video, so thank you guys for sticking with me. But before we end, I want to show you a couple other important things in our collection. So not only do we have a lot of the birds themselves, but we also have, you can see on this wall, we also have eggs. Eggs are also really important. When we're studying something like birds, right, they all hatch out of eggs. And again, all these eggs are organized by the family, the genus, the species, so they're organized in the exact same way. So I'll have you guys come and take a look. But the eggs themselves also give us important information, right? So that we can see in a nest, we can see how many eggs on average are being laid. And sometimes the number of eggs laid are an indication of how well the species is doing or how much food there is. So the more food is available, maybe the more eggs that they'll lay that year. With some species of birds, they only lay eggs once a year. Some lay more often, like chickens, right? So those tell us important information about the life histories of the animals. But the things like color variations as well, So within the same species, you might see different patterns, color patterns, depending on where that species, those particular individuals live. So for example, and I don't know that this is exactly the case, but an example could be great horned owls. Great horned owls are found all over the place in North America, and you could find them in forests, in deserts, right there, all over. And we see on adult birds, we do see some different color variations between birds that live in forests versus birds that live in deserts, right? Because their coloring is their camouflage. And perhaps we could see those similar variations in their eggs. I don't think that that's the case with great horned owls, but I was just giving an example of a possibility. But for ground nesting birds, so things like maybe killdeer, their eggs are camouflaged to help them blend in with the ground or the dirt or wherever those eggs are hatched. So different populations of killdeer may have slightly different patterns of colors on their eggs. I don't know that that's the case, but it's a possibility. But the way to find that out is by collecting them and comparing them. So we have eggs, and we have a question here.
David asks, is there a yolk in them?
No. So the yolk, if any of you guys have had this happen at home with chicken eggs, the yolks will rot and they smell really, really, really bad if they accidentally get broken. So with these eggs, so here, let me open this drawer again so you guys can see up really close. Let me bring one of the eggs to you. So on the egg, this may be really hard to see, but there's a little hole. So we drill a little hole and drain all the insides out. So it's just the shell. And then you can see this one also has some information written right on the shell. So rather than having a tag, because there's nowhere to tie a tag onto, like we saw with the birds, you can just write directly onto it. So yeah, we do not have the yolks or any of the insides in there, because that would make this place really smelly. Especially if somebody broke one on accident. That could be really bad. Now, one more thing. So I know we've got it in some of these. We are also occasionally, may not be able to find one, but we do have some nests as well for some of these birds. Because as you may have seen out in the wild, there are lots of different sizes of birds who do different things, and there are lots of different methods for building nests. Some make them inside of cavities, like in a tree. Some, like peregrines, just kind of make a scrape on a cliff ledge somewhere. And some birds make really intricate nests. Some are basic, some are on the ground, some are in trees. All kinds of different nests. And so we will occasionally collect the nests as well. And off the top of my head, I am not remembering where we have some of those. But here's a couple of cool birds too, if you guys want to come and look. Look at the tail on this bird. So yeah, along with the birds themselves, we also have eggs and we have some nests. And then, yeah, this one you can see was taxidermied at one point, so it was made to sit on some kind of a branch, and it has the fake eyes in it. Isn't that a cool bird? All right. Let's see. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in and asking questions. Oh, one more question before we go.
Cam asks, how many nests have you collected?
I don't know. I personally haven't collected any. And I don't work in this collection specifically either. I know we have a list of them somewhere, so I'm sure that our curators who are in charge of this collection have lists and could look it up. I'm sure the specific number of nests we have in our collection, but I don't know off the top of my head. But that's a good question. Great. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you learned something. If you have any other questions, feel free to comment. We'll be checking the comment sections periodically to answer your questions. So thanks again.